So just to give you some background on myself, I'm actually a local girl, born in Wahiawa, raised in Mililani, went to school at University of Hawaii at Manoa. I got my bachelor's and my master's in animal sciences, which is kind of unusual because that is actually with domesticated animals. But in the science field, it doesn't really matter. If you have an interest in science and you have professors and advisors that are willing to work with you, they're more than willing to work with you on anything. And the good thing about me, my work with NOAA was very supportive of me going back to school. I just went back to school maybe about 5 years ago to get my master's. I was very old, but they're very supportive. And because I didn't have to ask for any money or any support from the school, my old advisor was willing to take me back because he said, hey, if all you need is a signature, why don't you just come join us again? So that's what I ended up doing. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because throughout the years, I've been with NOAA for about 2 decades now. It's been a long time. So I've been there, seen from the beginning as the turtles program started growing, and now this is actually a brand new program for us. We had 2 different marine turtle programs, an assessment program and a research program, but we combined it because we were very small. Right now there is only 8 employees, so we're still very small put together, but it's kind of exciting because we're going in a little bit new directions as far as our research. So this kind of ties in and brings back my thesis of when I was studying. I was trying to figure out, do turtles actually have growth spurts? Because we know with previous studies, we're saying we estimate about 30 to 40 years it takes them to reach sexual maturity. And that's actually a very long time. At the same time, we also say that although a nest can contain maybe 100 to 120 eggs, maybe one of them will actually make it to adulthood. So, you know, with the long age, the long time it takes for them to reach sexual maturity, on top of only having 1 out of the 120 surviving, how do these turtles actually become recovered from their threatened status? As you all know, in Hawaii, the Hawaiian Green Sea Turtle is still considered threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And most recently, within the last couple of months, it was discovered to be a distinct population segment. So what that means is once our stock actually disappears in Hawaii, it's not like we can go to Florida or we can go to the Caribbean and grab another green turtle and bring it back here because it's a totally different genetic breed. So that's why we have to keep it classified as threatened, because there are still a lot of things that are unknown. So when I went back to school, you know, I thought about, do I want to work with data that I've been working with all these years? No, I want to go back to school. I want to learn something else. And I want to provide something that is useful for the program and maybe carry it forward and see what else can we do with this information. So from there, I decided, you know, no one's really focused on skeletal chronology, and that's actually the study of bones. And in our case with turtles, we use the humerus. It's the arm bone, the big arm bone. So in the sea turtle community, skeletal chronology is very familiar, and everybody uses it for aging and growth rates. So I wanted to take that and use it with the Hawaiian sea turtles. In addition, looking at sexual maturity, again, it takes them a long time to reach sexual maturity, but hey, are they similar to humans? Like, you know, once we hit a certain age, we hit puberty, we shoot up, we become sexually mature. You know, I wanted to know, do green sea turtles also have that? Maybe it may take them a little shorter time to reach sexual maturity because they have that growth spurt. So it may take them a little quicker to reach one age class to another. So I think I told you about the background. You guys are making it very comfortable for me because there's only 3 of you here. So in addition, why skeletal chronology? Can't you just do it, you know, every time you capture a turtle? Can't you just study it from there? And you can, but unfortunately, we do these studies called capture, mark, recapture. And what that really means is we go out, capture the turtle, measure it, weigh it, do all we can, release it, and we do that every following year. The only problem with that is it takes a lot of effort and takes a lot of time to actually study something like growth rates. You need to go back every year and calculate the difference between the 2 measurements and then the following year and so on. So it's going to be a very slow process. So with using skeletal to eliminate some of the long process, the unfortunate part is you do have to validate with skeletal chronology. You have to say, once you kind of analyze these bones, you have to be able to compare it to something that is known age. So we compare it to cut up in a bone of an unknown age turtle versus cut up a bone of a known age turtle. Say like something that was raised in captivity, maybe Sea Life Park, unfortunately, you know, their turtles also pass away, so we're able to get some samples from there. So we can kind of compare it. The other thing we can do is use fluorescent biomarkers. You can actually inject fluorescent markers into turtles' muscles, actually, and it actually goes into their bone. We record the date of when we actually injected the turtle, and then if it does happen to die, then we can actually see this fluorescent ring around the bone. And that kind of tells us, okay, that's a known date, that's a known age. From there, we can calculate, you know, this known growth rate. The other thing I was looking at is, like I said, maturation. Unfortunately, with green sea turtles, you can only tell sex or gender by looking at it externally once they're an adult, which is about 80 centimeters. So in our case, because we do collect, we are fortunate to collect stranded turtles, we're able to actually necropsy them at a later date. We take samples, measurements, and then specifically in my case, we saved humerus, and then we also saved the gonads. And then from there, we're able to actually analyze and determine whether or not it was sexually mature. With females, it's pretty easy. They develop egg follicles. Males, it's a little bit hard. You can see their gonad, but you can't really determine whether or not it's sexually mature without histologically looking at that testes. So to start really getting into a little bit more background, specifically with Hawaii, previous studies have noted that within the main Hawaiian Islands, as you can see here, back here, we looked at 4 different study sites. And from that 4 different study sites, that's how we got the 35 to 40 year sexual maturity age. But when we looked at a study site at Midway right here, unfortunately, that one gave us an age estimate of 50 years. And that was due to slow growth rates, and unfortunately, it was due to the lack of food sources and the cooler water temperature surfaces. So as I mentioned, there are challenges with skeletal chronology. There are people that actually don't believe it or don't believe in the use of it, but we here in Hawaii have been able to validate it, which is good, like I mentioned, with known age turtles. And what we've been able to determine is every time you've seen a line of arrested growth, and you'll see further pictures with this, but basically that's like a tree ring within the humerus bone, and each line that you see represents 1 year. So we've been able to validate that, so that's a good thing. But unfortunately, with the larger bones, as you can kind of see here as compared to a smaller bone, there's a lot more reabsorption of the inner core. So a lot of those lines are lost because they're reabsorbed into the bone. So you don't have all those inner lines or the older age years as opposed to a younger one, where you can really see that cortical hard bone mass, where you can really see clearly the lines of arrested growth. So that's a problem with that. So with my study, I had a couple hypotheses. Like I said, we thought for sure, although the average growth rates are very slow, we're estimating less than 2 centimeters per year. We think that some individuals may experience these surges of growth. So it gets them from one size class to another, or age class, we say from like juvenile to subadult, or even subadult to adult, so they can reach maturity very, very fast, maybe within 1 to 2 years. And sexual maturity can be also detected, as I mentioned, by looking at the gonads. With the females, it's pretty easy. You can look at the egg follicles. With the males, it's a little bit difficult with histological analysis of the testes, but it's still possible. And in my case, I've seen previous studies where they've done 2 separate studies. We've always seen people doing skeletal chronology as a separate study, and then histologically analyzing the gonads as a separate study, but I never really found a study that compared the 2, like looking at growth rates and maturity at the same time, seeing where they correlate. So that's what I was kind of curious at, and that's why I did my thesis. So as I mentioned, in the program that I work with, we've had a stranding and salvaging program since 1982, and it was more formally formed in like 1990. So as of, I believe, 2015, we have about 7,000 sea turtle stranding cases. And within those 7,000, we're able to collect a lot of those, and we have a lot of collaborators on the different islands as well. So we're able to collect all these carcasses. We save it until we can necropsy it, which is like an autopsy. We save samples such as I mentioned, the humerus. And you can tell where humerus is collected in, like I said, the front flipper, and the gonads is back here. And for my particular study, I used 99 humeri and 70 gonads. So 33 were testes, and then 37 were ovaries. And I keep talking about this size class or age class. So as I mentioned, there's 3 different size classes that we use. Juvenile, which we use a straight carapace length, which is the top shell, the length of that shell. If it's smaller than 65 centimeters, we consider it a juvenile. 65 to 81 centimeters subadult, and anything around 81 to greater is an adult. So you always hear me telling you about these different size classes. And it was actually devised by someone back in the 70s, but we had it modified. George Balaz actually modified it in about 1980 because he noticed that here in Hawaii, around 65 centimeters is when we saw that sexual dimorphism, whereas say in the mainland or the continental US, they were seeing it lower in 40 centimeters. So that's why ours is a little bit higher when we classify the subadult. And then just to show you, again, it's within the main Hawaiian Island chain. The pink reflects the females, the blues reflect the males. And then I do have 2 white diamonds. Unfortunately, the gender was unknown. Sometimes the carcasses we receive are fairly decomposed. So even when we cut them open, we really can't see anything. It becomes like mush. So there's nothing to really kind of visually locate the gonads. And again, talking about size classes, you see on the x-axis juvenile, subadult, and adult. And then the different colors, pinks reflect the females, and the males is the blues. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the two unknowns. Again, it kind of reflects pretty even distribution between the different size classes, and that's what I was trying to get. And if you break it down further into 10 centimeter size bins, as you can see on the x-axis, it's, you know, within the 40s, 30s to 90s is what it is. I also tried to get it pretty evenly dispersed, but unfortunately, with the larger size turtle, it's really hard for us to retrieve. So it's harder, of course, to have a sample from that size. So now getting into the nitty gritty of what I actually did. As I mentioned, again, use the humerus bone. Not like it matters, but I was using just the right side just for standardization, but sometimes I didn't have the right. Some of them were missing the front flipper, so I would just use the left, and it really didn't matter. And for me to determine where I would cut, like I mentioned, that highly cortical mass right here, you can see not as much porous right here, but it will really give me good clear lines to actually see those lines of arrested growth, as I mentioned. So that was just a starting point for me to make a cut. And from there, it ends up with this little section. So basically what happens is I cut through a bone, cut it through. I take a 1 to 3 millimeter section. I have to decalcify it to get all the calcium off so that it can be very flexible for shaving, because I have to take another section that's only 25 micrometers thin and then decalcify it again to allow it to accept this stain. And the stain allows me, that purple stain allows me to really clearly see the lines of arrested growth. And I think, unfortunately not this slide, the next slide I think is what it is. This is just showing you, people are asking, well, how can you take this bone and correlate it to a carapace? So what we do is we actually make sure that it's related and proportional. So we would plot, let me see, it is the humerus width here against the straight carapace length of the turtle. Then I plotted about 167 different turtles just to make sure that the relationship is proportional and it is valid, and that I can use these two measurements. Now I'll go into a little bit further if you want to hear about that. But so going into, again, the nitty gritty of now the gonads. So as I mentioned, I collected, let me see, 37 ovaries and 33 testes. So on the left, you have the female. Again, you can notice the difference with females. It's pretty wavy, ripply. That's how we can kind of tell it's a female, whereas the male, very smooth borders. That's what makes it very distinct. And the next one, going into specifics with females, like I said, it's pretty easy to do females. All I did really was measure the 5 largest follicles. And if I could, take a picture under a microscope so that I could measure it and then digitize it so that I could easily manipulate the data later on. With the males, it's a little bit difficult. The easy part is actually measuring it and then weighing the size of the testes. But to actually, to actually analyze it, I have to do a section of it as well, but I couldn't personally do it because I don't know how to do it. So I had to send it off to the UH to do it for me. And then I could actually tell whether or not the spermatozoa within the gonad was immature or mature. And I'll go into that a little bit later as well. So again, knowing all this, getting the information from the humerus bone and the gonads, what can I find? What did I determine? So first off, just to show you, this is a section of a stain. And these red lines, you can see on both the right and the left edges, represent a lag, which is a line of arrested growth. And as I mentioned, these are annular. So every line that you can see, this dark line I should mention, is a lag. So an annular growth consists of a lag and then a broad zone, and that consists of one growth increment. So that's one, then the next one is two. Between each one is another one. So there's 5 lags in this turtle. So you can calculate 4 growth rates from this particular stain, or section, I should say. So I did all 99 humeri that I had. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, 2, I didn't have the gender, so it didn't make sense for me to use those for analysis. And then, unfortunately, 3 of them, sometimes with these bones, they are very porous. And I think it's the next slide. Yep. Sometimes you get sections that are like this. So as I mentioned, how porous the bigger bones get, they start to reabsorb all these lines of arrested growth. You really can't determine any kind of lag around here. So unfortunately, I think I lost 3 of these because I just could not see anything in it. So this just shows you, I'm not going to go over it, you can read it. It's just, again, binning it by 10 centimeter size class. We got this mean. and the total number of growth rates that I was able to calculate. So out of the 99, I was able to calculate 297 growth rates. As I said, some sections could give me nothing, so that wasn't used, but some other sections could give me up to like 10 or even 11 different lags. So I had all these growth rates within one section. So the cool thing about that is, although I only have one measurement, I only have the final length or width of the bone and the turtle, with each lag, by using the distance between each lag, I can also calculate a distance, and you input it into this formula, it can actually tell you what the estimate carapace length of that turtle was at this particular lag. So it's pretty cool. You can kind of guess, at what point did it reach this certain size. And then this one, again, just using the 10 centimeter size bins on the x-axis, and then you can see the percent of growth spurts. I was able to find that you can see each size bin actually had a growth spurt. The highest, of course, the females were in the 70 to 79, and with the males, it was actually in the 40 to 49. That's kind of important. What we were noticing is, okay, 70 to 79 females, that's actually kind of reaching adulthood. Still in the adulthood, that's when they're kind of, reaching sexual maturity, which is what we expect, right? From going from a subadult to an adult, that's when we kind of hit puberty. But the males are kind of unusual. We're like, this is 40 to 49. This is the juvenile phase. Why are they, hitting, I would say, puberty earlier than in the subadult? That kind of was very unusual. So we kind of was looking at that kind of funny, thinking, put that in the back of your head. And another way of looking at this as well is, okay, so all these growth spurts that I took, what is this exactly telling us? So it might be a little confusing, so I apologize. The x-axis is all the growth rates. So again, this is per year. Each number represents a 0.5 bin. So 4 is actually from 3.5 to 4 centimeters per year. 12 represents 11.5 to 12 centimeters. On your left y-axis, you have cumulative frequency. So how often do you see these growth spurts, or growth rates, I should say, I'm sorry. And on your right is just the frequency of how often you should see this growth spurt. So if you look at the cumulative, you're going to look at these green dots. So if you look at the peak, it's about here, and I have it written out because I can't really see it from here. It's about 2 centimeters per year is where you're going to see 80% of all of your growth rates. And that's what I said. That's pretty much the average. We see about 1.5 to 2 centimeters per year. So that makes sense. But for how often or how big the growth spurts is, well, 90% of the time, again, you'll see 1.8 to about 2 centimeters per year you'll see in a turtle, as opposed to, say, a 12 centimeter growth rate per year, less than, way less than 1%. It's like pretty much a 0. So this is, again, going off of the average. We're looking at the average. So again, keep that in mind, that's average. So now switching back over to gonads. So for the follicles, again, I'm just showing you this is what I did, just measuring them. It's what we expected. As the straight carapace length increases, we would expect to see this follicle size increase, which kind of makes sense. The bigger the follicle, the mature the turtle is. So the smaller the turtle, the smaller the follicles. For males, like I mentioned, it's a little bit more difficult. You can't just look at the size of a testes or a weight, because that's not going to tell you maturity. So we had to do it histologically. And as you can see in the image on the left, basically the seminiferous tubules are small. And if you look at the mature, they're actually a lot larger. And then spermatozoa actually head towards the center of the tubules. So that's you're looking at specifically right here. So I basically had to look at each slide to determine whether or not it was mature. So for the males, of the 33 testes, of course, as we expected, there's no juveniles. For the subadults, we had 3, and then 8 adults. It's kind of interesting is here in the immature, we still had some adults, 3, that was immature, and we're not quite certain why. And then unfortunately, we had some testes that were just too autolyzed or too degraded for us to even determine whether or not it was mature or not. So, okay, putting everything together. This is looking at, and I'm sorry if this is confusing, please stop me if this is, what we're trying to compare is the follicle diameter, as you saw in that earlier graph, along with growth spurts, which is these green triangles in each of the 10 centimeter bin, and then percent growth spurts. I'm sorry, these are the percent growth spurts within each bin. The thing to remember is, in the following slide as well, this is the female, I'm gonna show you the male. It's pretty much the same. You'll see this flat line in the juvenile phase, so not really much growth. As it heads into the juvenile to subadult phase, as determined by these dotted lines, that's how it's separated, it gets this slight increase, and it increases even further as it's an adult. Again, remember that 79 per centimeter size female was seeing those spurts. It just confirms again, yes, in that size class, we're seeing 35% of growth spurts, the highest for the females. And for the males, same kind of graph. Again, you'll see that's flat line in the juvenile age where not much growth, and it starts to increase in subadult and even further in adults. Like I mentioned, it's even smaller though in the 50, I can't see it from this side. I think it's like within the 50 centimeter range. So again, smaller, not what we expect because it's still a juvenile. Why are these growth spurts occurring when it's even smaller? So it kind of made us curious as to, so what does this really all mean and how do we put it all together to make any kind of sense? So the interesting thing about looking at the gonads, everybody determines gonadal development by morphometrics, or mainly the size of the turtle, not really looking at anything else. And unfortunately, and looking at hormones. For our study, we did not. We were looking at more the length of the turtle, but also follicle diameter. And we can confirm, yes, as the carpus of the turtle increased, we did see that follicle size increase. So that makes sense. As the turtle gets bigger, the more mature it will get. And of course, the correspondence of size classes to skeletal chronology, along with the maturity, generally worked out with a couple exceptions. So all but 2 of the adult females were considered sexually mature. They actually had egg follicles smaller than the 3 millimeter, but we did note that they were close to about 83 centimeters, which means that they were just entering the adult phase. So that kind of makes sense. That doesn't seem out of the ordinary. But for the males, it's a little bit more unusual. A 76.5 centimeters male was found with maturing spermatozoa. Again, he's kind of nearing adulthood, so that wasn't that off. 3 adulthoods nearing about 75 suggests the possibility that this adulthood could be reached maybe as a turtle reaches maybe closer to 80 and not necessarily 81. And even more interesting, this slide is actually showing testes of a 60 centimeter male, and he actually had maturing spermatozoa. And that again is in the juvenile phase. So we didn't quite understand why something like a 60 centimeter showed maturing spermatozoa as compared to an adult which showed none. So there appears to be growth spurts occurring, as we saw, throughout the entire lifespan of a turtle. The only difference is we do know that within the sexes, there appears to be differences. As I mentioned, the females are peaking like 70 range, the males are about 50 to 60 range. So, but we did find that within other studies, we found that similarly to Australia, they were finding the same kind of disparity between the 2 growth rates. But using both methods, we were able to correlate, growth spurt along with maturity. It actually did match up with the difference of males possibly being a little bit smaller than females. So in order to determine stock assessment, we want people to maybe possibly not look at both sexes with the same kind of size range. Maybe we need to shift the males a little lower. And we also know that now we should probably be focusing a little bit more on the late subadult phase for males, or maybe even late juveniles, to really figure out when do these turtles actually become sexually mature. Is it not in the 80 and maybe it's more closer to like 60, which is very unusual, but we should probably look at more of these size specifically turtles. Just to summarize what I've been blabbing about, this is just a general background. So previous studies using average growth rates provide actually an inaccurate life history and actually overestimate age to maturity. These are 2 very important factors in managing and protecting these animals. So these are kind of basically what I just kind of went over. I'll let you read a little bit more. Guys, good? Next slide. And again, just summarizing again the methods that I use. This is more on the skeletal chronology because it was a little bit more difficult to actually explain in procedures. Maturity was a little bit more easier because I just used the gonads. Like I mentioned, females very easy, measuring the egg follicles. Males a little bit more difficult, but once I got the section mounted, I could just look at it through a microscope and determine whether or not it was sexually mature. So in this study, lags, lines of arrested growth, were used to determine growth rates and growth spurts in both the females and the males, and gonads analysis was used to determine sexual maturity. I'm sorry, that's just a lot. Like I said, there's just a lot to know about the bone part of it. Okay, you're still reading. You guys okay? Okay. And again, just summarizing the results. So there is a difference between females and males, as the females' growth spurts were found in the subadult phase, again, nearing the 70-ish centimeter size, whereas the males were actually kind of in the juvenile, nearing the subadult phase, so the 50 to 60 centimeter size. And although the average growth rate is about 1 to 4 centimeters per year, 75% of all these turtles that I analyzed actually had at least one growth spurt, meaning that turtles can pass quickly from one age class to the next. So moving from juvenile to subadult or subadult to adult. I think this is a short one. Okay, and then the last one I have, the summary for my conclusion, is finding growth spurts imply that this is an important factor in determining the life history of a turtle. But we must be careful to recognize that there are differences between the sexes as it affects how quickly they grow and also how quickly they reach sexual maturity. Everybody's good on that. So taking all this, again, this is part of my thesis, and that was a couple of years ago. And moving forward with this, we know what we found out, and how do we move forward knowing this information to help this population? As I mentioned, it is recovering. It is one of the few remaining recovering nesting female populations, so that's good. But unfortunately, we are still missing a lot of unknown information. And this is not uncommon. A lot of sea turtle species, or even marine species in general, we have these missing blocks of information. For turtles, we call it the lost years. Once they emerge from their nest, run out as a hatchling into the ocean and head to the deep sea, we don't know what happens to them while they're out there. We know that, or we can guess that they're feeding on algal mats in the high seas and they're just kind of floating along with it. But at what age and what size do they actually return to the nearshore waters? We all see them around 35 centimeters, the juvenile age, but is that truly the size that they return back to shore? So we know that, hey, I probably have to analyze more bones to get a little bit more information on the growth rates, especially figuring out the difference between the two sexes. But in addition, as I mentioned with the lost years, we want to know, well, okay, the difference between oceanic, which is the high seas, and nearshore. We know there's two different types of foraging grounds or feeding material that's out there in these two locations. And what we can do is using stable isotope analysis, you can actually analyze with the bone. I can actually core it, take a section of it, and they can actually determine the amount of carbon and nitrogen in there. And the differences between what's out in the ocean and what's near shore can really tell us, hey, we can pick up at this age, they're actually still out in the high seas, but then at this age, because they're eating more carbon or nitrogen or whatever it is, they're actually back at shore. So we can determine specifically at what age do they come back to Hawaiian shores. So this is actually where we're heading to right now. And we just have an intern that started this week, and she's going to help us start this work. So it's kind of exciting to continue on this path, but we'll see how much work it entails as well. So is there any questions? I know that was a lot of information. And that was just my last slide, just to show that. I do appreciate you guys coming down. This is one of the turtles on the North Shore that we actually put a satellite transmitter. I think it's barely visible. It's right there. And we released it. And they actually, I don't know, this is going off topic, but they actually head back to French frigate shows and nests is what we find. We think 90% of all Hawaiian turtles head back up to French frigate shows. And within the little French frigate shows, there's a bunch of little islands in there. East Island, we believe 50% of all sea turtles nest at that one island. The good thing is that we do have 2 staff members out there right now for 5 months, and they'll be monitoring that island, tagging whoever they can, even basking males, which is something new for us. So that's also exciting as well. We haven't really studied the males too much. We talk about females so much because they're the ones that come ashore. They're the ones that nest. Males kind of do their thing in the water with the female. They may bask, but then we really don't see them. So that's kind of exciting too. There is. We have it on the North Shore as well. Kahuku side is what we've been getting calls on. The interesting thing is on Kailua, I don't know. We don't exactly know where. The thing is, green turtles, it's pretty easy to distinguish their nests. But with hawksbills, it's a little bit more different. The funny thing is, because of our stranding program, people know who we are. And if they find anything unusual, they'll call us. We were finding hawksbill hatchlings. And we actually checked out that stretch of beach and we couldn't find a nest. I mean, there's a lot of vegetation, as you know, near the houses. So it's kind of hard to determine. So we know there's hawksbill nests somewhere out there. We just don't know specifically where. And if you know, we would like to know too. That's kind of, their numbers are really low. I mean, we're guessing maybe 15 nesting females for the entire chain.
Where are they usually nest?
Big Island, Molokai, trying to think. Lanai, back in the days, they said there was some nesting, but really Molokai, Big Island, and Maui. Sorry, Maui as well. Yeah. Not so much Oahu is known for hawksbills though. Hawksbill they haven't seen, but the exciting thing, because they're out there for so long this year, they're able to go out to the other little islands out there, but they have not reported any hawksbills. We've had reports of entangled small hawksbills, but they haven't seen the big adults out there. So that's kind of curious.